I mean, I think one of the joys of reading your books, The Master and His Emissary, but particularly the latest book, is that you pretty well describe the process of the, first of all, the overtaking of the left hemispheric vision that's endemic in our current culture, as you so cogently argue, both in the book and in many of your talks. And without having read your books, I had already started to write about this in my own particular way, without your expert neurological knowledge, although I do have some of your psychological background, because, as you know,
yes.
I was a Jungian analyst.
Yes.
And I think that it was partly my background in English literature, which was a bit like you, but I came from a literary background, academic literary background, into a psychological background. And I've now gone into novel writing, and you have gone into a different kind of philosophical tradition. But there's a sense in which, in all my books, without actually knowingly following the McGilchrist philosophy, I've been writing about characters who evolve through what you might call the rebalancing of their vision of the world, moving left hemispheric, rather rule-bound, constrained attitude to life.
Yes.
To a much more open Gestalt view of life. Sorry, go on.
No. I've noticed that in your, well, it's hardly hard to notice that in your novels you often set people in a new situation that is perhaps an unaccustomed world for them, and that allows you to cross a sort of boundary. Yes. And you introduce ideas, experiences that on the whole our rather reductionist left hemisphere dominated culture would balk at. Have you found that readers do find these passages where you sort of do, for want of a better word for it, you show them encountering the supernatural, or at any rate the I wouldn't necessarily call it supernatural. I'd call it the natural, the bit that we've left out. But do you find people are open to it, or criticisms for it?
A lot of people love it. It's very much like you. I mean, I don't think I have your worldwide and now global popularity, and good for you. I'm really grateful that you have forged this path, which I think we badly need. But the kind of readers who really like my work like exactly that. They love the fact that I mean, David Bentley Hart, who is a theologian who I think you know, who has a not dissimilar philosophical outlook to yourself. I mean, you come from slightly different angles at it, but you're very similar, I think, in a lot of your sense of the world being a unity and conscious at every level. He talks about, I mean, I was talking to him the other night for his channel, and he said that he liked my books because they had the natural, the preternatural, the supernatural, and the transcendent, which, I mean, I wouldn't say I consciously do. That would be too will dominated. But I mean, I think just to sort of illustrate it, and not too much to blow my own trumpet, there is a passage from my first novel, because I didn't start writing until I was 50. So my first novel,
this is Miss Garnet's Angel. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, she is a bit taken. I mean, everyone says your first novel is account of your own life. It isn't at all. But I did grow up in a communist household, and I did grow up in an atheist. I'm a very good word, but it meant that whole element of another dimension was pretty much, it wasn't exactly forbidden, but it was belittled. And so I don't think it's an accident that Miss Garnet starts life as a very intelligent, well-educated. She's been to Somerville. She's got a history degree. She's a teacher, but she's a communist and she's an atheist. And the friend she's going to visit Venice with dies, which is the first shock. And then she goes to Venice and she encounters the paintings by Guardi in the Chiesa dell'Angelo Raffaelli, which tell the story of Tobias and the Angel, which happens to be a story I've taught when I'm teaching classes on ancient literature, or when I did in the past. So it's a story I know very well. I know it goes down very well, and painters love it. And the novel really retells the story of Tobias and the Angel alongside her contemporary story. And the one character who makes the crossover is the Archangel Raphael. And as the novel progresses, her left hemispheric, rational, limited, dismissive intellect starts to be eroded, partly by the sheer beauty of Venice, partly by the art she becomes acquainted with, partly through an unhappy love affair. She falls unsuitably in love with a man who is in fact homosexual. She begins to see visitations of what turns out to be the Archangel Raphael. And there is a bit which is, I think it's a very good, though I say it myself, description of what you're talking about when you're talking about the imagination as an engaging with reality, and not, as it were, putting things in and making things up, as people sometimes think of as imagination, but actually revealing something which is there behind the quotidian reality. So shall I read you that bit, or is it?
I think that would be great. Yes, please do.
Cut it if it's too long or too boring.
No.
But it's the bit, you know, when I wrote Miss Garnet's Angel, I had read your first book, which is Against Criticism.
Yes, but I was trying to remember how it was we came across one another, but I think it might have been...
It was Against Criticism. Then I read The Master and His Emissary, and I wrote to you and said, are you, by any chance, the chap who wrote Against Criticism? On a journey which is rather similar to my own. And it turned out you had, and that's how we got in touch. But this is the passage from Miss Garnet's Angel. So she's befriended a pair of twins who are restoring a chapel. Actually, I made it up. It's the one bit of the book that I made up in terms of the actual Venetian background. All the rest is absolutely Venice, which city I know rather well. But this particular chapel is connected to the Chiesa dell'Angelo Raffaelli. It has a role in the story of Raphael, because Raphael, by legend, came on the Silk Road through the merchants' ships from the east to Venice, because originally he and the other archangels actually derived from Persia, which is a little about the archangels. But anyway, this is in the kind of moment when she starts to look at the world in a different way. When Julia Garnet came out, gulls were wheeling around the sky, and looking up, she saw him again, as she had known she would. He was not at all obvious. There were no clear signs, but up on the roof you could see, if you had a mind to it, that this was not an ordinary man. For a start, he stood without visible support on the roof's spine, balancing weightlessly against the air like a sail, except that the apparition did not sway as he stood. He stood poised as if anchored by the finest gold thread to an infinite sky. Julia Garnet, when she glimpsed him first, that day she had invited the twins to tea and had so suddenly ushered them inside, had been struck by something she could not at first pin down. Later, when the children had gone, And she would been washing later when the girl had gone and her hostess was washing the tea things, she received an impression of what it was that was peculiar. The figure had the transparency of the ordinary. Like a bird's nest concealed in the flourish of a tree, he had stood against the red tiled roof with the outlines of a man, and yet so easily passed over. Did the birds notice him? She had wondered that evening, stacking the saucers carefully. She had not thought to observe whether the starlings had evaded the presence she had so swiftly averted her eye from. Why, then, she could not quite fathom, as they roamed past the red roofs in their cloudy gangs. But seeing him again, her impression now, as she watched the gulls circle the cerulean sky, was that they might fly straight through him, so silently, and what was it about him? So unassumingly he stood there. And she understood better why, on the first sighting, she had felt that strange need to look away. There was something about the extremity of his self-containment which was on the edge of being terrifying. And yet it was not terror she felt now, for all in an instant she saw that she had spent her life keeping terror at bay. It was more like the sudden detaching from inside her body of a huge and cumbersome weight, which she had carried around unawares. A lightness, an acute lightness seemed to issue from where the presence rested, just above the statue of the angel, as though laughing at his own reflection in stone. It was a lightness which transmitted itself to Julia Garnet and searched through her, down to her toes. Later, she supposed that the feeling was probably somewhat akin to orgasm, were she in a position to make such a comparison. And although it was inside only the splinter of a second she observed him, in that moment she knew he had been there forever. So that's
Gosh, yes. What a marvelous evocation. Yes. And you emphasize this sort of, you could almost miss it if you like. It was so a lot of people would think like a vision of an archangel would be something where bright light would shine and you'd fall to the ground. But no, this is something that, as it were, you could overlook quite easily. And probably we do.
I'm very struck in all your work, Ian, by this very point you make. I mean, what you seem to be saying in all your work is that, the world is a wonderful place. It's full of riches. It's full of immense meaning. But we've lost the art of seeing into the life of things, as Wordsworth said. What I'm trying to do in my fiction is, I suppose, bring my characters to a place where they start to see the different levels of reality. And I do it very much in my most recent book, which you were kind enough to say you enjoyed, The Garnet, which is really very much about the natural world and what we miss there.
Yes, yes. Well, and it's another example, isn't it, of somebody coming from a different setting into a new place and finding something that's very down to earth there, but also something slightly enchanted, I suppose one would say, in this garden of this old house that she's moved to out of London.
Yes.
Hassie is her name, isn't it? Yes, Hassie and her sister, whose name I can't remember.
Margot, well done. Yes.
Yes, yes. Good. Yes, yes.
Well, she's called Halcyon. Her father's a birdwatcher, and her name is
right. Okay.
Days. So she's called Halcyon Days, and it's a sort of joke that her father.
Yes, I remember.
She goes by the name of Hassie, but the Halcyon, which is the but just in case people don't know, is the it is known in myth as the kingfisher. So the kingfisher becomes her sort of important symbol. And the garden is an old garden, and to get to the village where she's, the nearby village, the house is on its own, a little away from the village. She has to go through an ancient wood which has a pool in it. And at one point, she sees a kingfisher flash across the pool. And this is really the sort of beginning of the opening out of the environment into something which is much older and deeper. I mean, I'm playing a lot on A Midsummer Night's Dream, as I think you pointed out when you read the book, because there are indeed presences in the wood, but they are, I did it so lightly that quite a lot of people miss the fact that there were these alternative other presences in the wood, and really just a couple of sisters coming to terms and someone getting over a love affair by working on a garden, which of course is there as well, but isn't really the heart of the book. The heart of the book is my attempt through using these rather ancient symbols to indicate that there are more things between heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Well, dreamt of in your philosophy, they obviously are.
Yes. Well, yes, it's another instance, isn't it, of what you were talking about, that there are many levels, and perhaps of what David Bentley Hart was talking about, the natural, the preternatural, the supernatural, and the transcendent. But I mean, what I liked about it, what resonated with your account of this, is, of course, that this was not willed in any way. And I feel the book is not willed according to a plan. I may be wrong, but it feels like it develops organically. And that we find these resonances, I would call them, after the fact, as it were, and they're terribly important and pleasing because we didn't put them there, as it were, but they come to meet us. Like, you know, you're saying that you didn't sort of anticipate necessarily getting. We find these people, and we find that other people have been saying things. I think you started by saying, as it were, you know, I didn't know what you were saying when I was writing these novels, but they clearly conform to a certain way of thinking, which we share. And that's been very much my experience. I mean, it's rather like Molière's Monsieur Jourdain discovering that all his life he'd been speaking prose, you know, without knowing it. And I find that, for example, Buddhists and Jungians beat a path through my door, and I've never really consciously made an effort to be a Buddhist or to be a Jungian, but all I know about both of these traditions recommends them very much to me. And then you find also who seem to have anticipated, if you like, the way of thinking that you have. You've not read them before, you've not heard anyone talk about them, but there they are. I mean, for me, that was the experience of reading Bergson, and to some extent William James, who I knew only in a rather technical way, although I read varieties of religious experience as a teenager. And
I think we share a view that the arts in our society has somehow become somewhat impoverished. I have to be a bit careful saying this, because in a sense I'm talking about colleagues, and I don't want to be dissing my colleagues, but I feel that there's a sort of impoverishment in the kind of areas that are available for exploration and the kind of subject matter that one can write about. I mean, for example, I get quite a lot of flack from a certain kind of rather snotty critic for the fact that I write about, that I use things like angels and fairies and spirits and gods and goddesses. Not, in my view, in any kind of airy-fairy sort of mind, body and spirit way, but simply because these are traditional images that have a timeless resonance, have been used throughout cultural history, if I can use such a word as cultural, giving shape to these intangible presences that seem to have spoken to people throughout known civilization. So it isn't that I'm sort of trying to convey a world with people in sort of pink frocks and sparkly headdresses. It's more, I have a great respect for ancient stories and ancient myths, as I know you do too. And I try to very often to bring those sort of stories, and stories very often that have survived, as Tobias and the Angels survived, or the Oedipus myth, which I write about in my story about Freud. And it suits a lot of people, but people are really rather frightened of acknowledging that this is something that they do find nourishing and absorbing. But anyway, just let me read this bit so that I can because I'd like to talk to you about dreams, and it just gives a bit of a flavour of it. She's walking through the wood. I halted by the pool, this is in the wood, where tiny insects were fizzing, and watched a dragonfly, its sequined twig of a body, never quite settling, shimmer just above the surface of the water, like a magician's trick. As I watched, an echoing bolt of bright turquoise shot by. In the days of first knowing Robert, that's the lover that she's parted with, she doesn't understand why. And in fact, we never learn why, because that wasn't what was interesting me in the story. In the days of first knowing Robert, I had looked eagerly for propitious omens, a black cat, a white horse, a crescent moon to wish on. Now the kingfisher, my bird, seemed to carry some message or sign. I had with me my father's old haversack, which I'd taken to carrying about, to ensure I always had a bird book to hand. It made a useful outdoor cushion, and I set it down on a natural seat formed by the humped roots of a big oak, and waited. I sat for some time, trying to ignore the insects whining about my head, first observing a bustling iridescent beetle, and then a lettuce-green angular-backed insect, high-stepping fastidiously over the minute white flowers that embroidered the mossy surround. I had never before taken much account of insects, but its intricate form seemed to me now exquisitely delicate, and its colouring preternaturally green beside the green of the moss. Yet it's part of nature, so it can't be unnatural, I thought. A tiny snail with a translucent violet and yellow striped shell climbing over a rotting log began to fascinate me. I diverted myself by searching my mind for other unnatural, natural things, lightning and peacocks, stalactites and red-spotted toadstools, duck-billed platypuses and mistletoe. I was distracted from this by the sight of a nuthatch making its way headfirst down another of the aged oaks, and then by a wren which began to thread bobbin-like through a thicket of blackberry, and all of a sudden a thrush on an overhanging rowan, its pale freckled breast puffed out, started up a refrain. But Dad, what about readings? I had asked. This is a conversation with her father before he dies. The darkling thrush, if you must read something. I like that one. He knew his birds. As if in response to the thrushes, a yellow bill poked out of one of the hazel bushes, and a male blackbird hopped out. It cocked its head on one side consideringly, then flew up to a blossoming bough of wild cherry, paused for half a beat, and then began a melodious counterpoint to the thrush duet. But the silent imperial kingfisher, having once revealed itself, remained aloof. I awoke with a start, wondering where on earth I had been, until I felt the damp moss beneath my hand and the oak burl digging into my shoulder. The gold shards of sunlight had dissolved into a soft silvery fan of fingers, and the drifts of snow-white windflowers had become puddles of ghostly pearl. The sky through the lacework of foliage was trailing ribbons of dark rose. From the echoing calls of the homing rooks, I deduced I had slept for over an hour. I had dreamt. There had been voices, a strange chanting. But as I tried to catch hold of it, the dream, already a fading echo, slid away from me, a mere tracery of notes into the gathering dusk. For one of those moments which seem afterwards, when summoned back, to have slipped outside time, I felt I might go after it, as though if I set off at once, and followed the will-o'-the-wisp dream, I might find out some great, undisclosed, elusive secret. And then the moment passed, and I was alone in the darkening wood. I don't normally put dreams in books because I normally don't like dreams much in books, but I think what I was trying to say, having read your book, is that it was her beginning to look at the natural world in a close and very different sort of way that somehow opens her consciousness out into something which becomes a rather significant dream. I mean, what happens in the dream recurs later on. I don't want to go on boring you with my book, but I think this is so very much what you're writing about, isn't it?
Yes, I imagine it is. I was thinking that what you were saying though, when you were talking about the state of modern literature, and I know you didn't want to be disrespecting your colleagues and so forth, is that it seems undeniably that in the last 100 years, art has become much more self-conscious. It's become much more about ideas and less about transformative experiences. And that what you are trying to do is to get the metaphorical, the symbolic, the below explicit level acting in your work, because it's from that that all the imaginative and emotional power comes. When you make it all explicit and turn it into a tub-thumping tirade about a certain philosophical point of view, it's not much of a work of art anymore. It's more a treatise or a harangue. And I think what you're doing is inevitably, when you are going to talk about these things, you go to the symbols, the metaphors, the myths that are the only way in which we can talk about these things. And since you are 3 times steeped in this, both as an expert on Lit, as a Jungian analyst, and as a writer of novels, it's not surprising that these myths, in some cases very explicitly, of course it's a biblical story, but it's one of the great myths in Miss Garnet, but also the extraordinary business of the myth of Oedipus, retold to Freud by Tiresias as he's dying in London, in Where Three Ways Meet. Is it?
Where Three Ways Meet. Yes, Where Three Roads Meet. It's the place
Three Roads Meet. Yes,
where he kills his mother.
Yes.
Yes,
that's right. Yes, I couldn't remember that it's ways, paths, or roads, but yes. So I think people are just typically misunderstanding what you're doing if they go, "Oh, I don't believe in fairies," and so on, because you've got to use these metaphors. It's like people who misunderstand the deeply metaphorical nature of most of the Bible, and I know there are people who take it terribly literally. And these people, if they're believers, are almost as worrying to me as the people who take it as literal because they're, as it were, Dawkins, and therefore dismiss it. So what you're doing is steering a path through the Scylla and Charybdis, as a myth for you, of these different ways in which one can founder as one tries to find a way through to the imaginative depths, which I think you reach in your work.
I have the character that I usually have a character in my books who is as unlike me in my actual lived life as possible, but to whom I tend to give my opinions. It's a sort of little, it's a kind of authorial conceit. In Miss Garnet's Angel, I gave my opinions to the Monsignor, and much to my surprise, he was a rather popular character. So I thought, oh, all right, well, I'll go on. And in this particular book, it's the character called Miss Foot, who is not like me in any other way. I mean, but many of her, I mean, not entirely my opinions, but quite a few of them are. And she says at some point, I really don't understand the modern age. I mean, why do people think that they're better than Shakespeare? I mean, Shakespeare believed in fairies. What makes them think that that there's anything there. And we don't actually know whether Shakespeare believed in fairies. What he was prepared to do was work with the images of
exactly
a realm of being that lies between the human world and the natural inanimate world, as it were representations of the consciousness that you write about as being present in all things, which I firmly believe. I mean, again, you have given remarkable research validity to something that I've always felt absolutely, really, since childhood, that everything about us has some form of consciousness. And I think I have a feeling that most, I'd like to say all, but I better not say all, I think most children are born with that feeling, and it gets educated out of them.
Yes, in fact, in writing The Matter with Things, I looked at research on children and their views of the world, their philosophy, their spiritual lives. And Dawkins thunders that no child would ever... Richard Dawkins says it doesn't deserve to be lambasted right, left and centre, except that he does become very strident about certain things and actually goes into uppercase at times, saying, "How dare you do this to children?" As though children only believe these things because they were indoctrinated into them by wicked adults.
Yes.
But in fact, the research shows precisely the opposite, that children naturally, even in families that are atheistic, and by the way, I grew up in a family that was atheistic, broadly speaking. I mean, my parents never took me to church, never talked about religion. That kind of thing was not on the menu. But children who are brought up in families or even in cultures such as Soviet Russia talk in these terms. And it's only when they get to about 7 in school that they realize that it's not smart to talk like this. And so they're discouraged.
Well, I'm an example of that. I mean, I had a very strong relationship with a cherry tree in the. We lived with my godparents when I was growing up, and there was a beautiful wild cherry with a white blossom that grew just outside. My bedroom was actually with my godparents, which probably saved my bacon because my parents were very good people, but it was a tense household, so I rather escaped. Outside my window was the most beautiful wild cherry, and I had a very deep relationship with this cherry. I used to talk to the cherry talked to me, and one of the most traumatic moments in my early childhood was when the cherry tree blew down. There was a great hurricane.
Oh, gosh.
When I was about 8 or 9, I think. And I was devastated because this was, without it, with no encouragement from my parents, absolutely. I mean, I never talked to them about it. I was absolutely certain I had this relationship with this being. And indeed, I remember coming back from school and saying to my mother very rather shyly, "Is it all right if I pray?" And she burst into fits of laughter. It was so I was definitely a child who receptive to the notions of something other. I mean, I wasn't particularly receptive to formal church going, but I was receptive to the notion that there was something mysterious about the world.
Yes.
Something about the world was not explicable by, the science we learnt at school. And so, not to rush science. I have a high respect for science, but there's something afoot, isn't there, that is squashing the range that's available to our children, and I think it's serious.
Yes, I think so. But I think there's also a drift, a very discernible drift the other way, a realization that this has gone far too far. And as people realize how intellectually, imaginatively, and spiritually barren the version of the world that they think science tells them they have to have, is, then they want to move away from it. In fact, the irony is that science can tell them no such thing at all. It's not a necessary part of science to adopt this view at all. And in fact, physicists are an enormously spiritually minded group of people. I think in the book I quote from the data on Nobel Prize winners, and Nobel Prize winners in the humanities. Something like 35% of them, at least historically over 100 years, have been known to be atheists or agnostics. But when it comes to science, very many fewer, but biologists are more atheistic. And as you get down to physicists, it's only 4.7% of all physicists were known at any point in their life ever to be atheistic or agnostic. And so if biology catches up with physics, it's about 100 years behind in its philosophy. But there are now many voices that can't be ignored that are saying this mechanistic view simply doesn't hold water. So I think that's crumbling, actually. In fact, it was crumbling while I was writing, and I only sort of realized that it was crumbling almost at the last minute before the book was published. But since then, I've seen evidence that it is much more. So I think people are aware that we need very much more to life than this. And one interesting thing from my point of view is that both my grandfathers were atheists, and both of them were scientists. And my father was a scientist of a kind. He was a doctor, at any rate. And as I recount in the book, he was not not particularly impressed by the arts and all that, and certainly not by religion. In almost rebellious, I sort of caused him to despair by telling him once I left school I was going to become a monk. But in any case, yes. What I'm saying is that without any particular encouragement, I already began to feel very strongly the sort of things that you're talking about, and referring to you were glancingly referring to something which has now become quite popular in mainstream philosophy as well, panpsychism.
Yes.
But I remember when I was about 13 or 14 being absolutely entranced by Graves's The White Goddess, which yes. of course talks very much about how these trees traditionally have their spirits, their goddesses, and so on. And this re-enchanted the world in a most wonderful way. And because I wasn't having a sort of anti-male and sort of almost compulsorily pro-female point of view rammed down my throat, it never occurred to me to do anything other than adore this white goddess. It seemed so important. Anyway, so I was lucky to make that discovery at that point in my life.
I want to try something out on you, and this, if you don't mind. I mean, yeah. I'm sort of slightly... I have not spoken about this to anybody, so this is something I have just decided this minute to talk to you about. Don't worry, I'm not going to confess some terrible personal tragedy. For reasons of my own, I've been looking at the creation myth in Genesis, the story of the Garden of Eden. It doesn't matter why I was doing that. I do these things. And I had a couple of conversations with David Bentley Hart about it, actually. They have not been filmed, although I think we might do one at some point. I get on with my thinking. He makes the point that if you look at what's said in the story of the Garden of Eden, the first 3 chapters of Genesis, Yahweh, who in the second chapter is called Yahweh, and Yahweh in the first chapter he's called Elohim. There are 2 kinds of names for God that are used in the opening books of Genesis. Actually lies to the human couple, to Adam and Eve. He tells them that if they eat of this tree, of the knowledge of good and evil, or knowledge of everything good and bad, as some people say, they will die immediately. And of course they don't. So in fact, the serpent tells them the truth and God lies. So that was one thing I thought about. Then I went and looked at various other creation myths from Mesopotamia around that time. And I started to delve quite a lot deeper into the actual Genesis story. And I read a lot of extremely academic books, papers. By no means are these mind, body, and spirit sort of whiffly-waffly people. These are people who read ancient languages. They read the Ugaritic texts. The Ugaritic texts are some texts that arose around the city of Ugarit, which is on the coast in what is now Syria, and they had a whole set of myths and stories. I read about the Canaanite myths, and what it seems to me, I can't say certainly, but it seems to me almost incontrovertibly the case, is that Yahweh, in his original presentation in the early Israelite religion, Hebrew religion, I would have to call it, because they're not really called Israelites until later, was married. And who was he married to? He was married to Asherah, who was a tree goddess. He was not the top god at all. He was beneath El. El was the top god. El had a number of people under him, one of whom was Yahweh, married. And there are a number of images in Genesis where you can see the kind of leftover. First of all, there's quite a lot of talk about Yahweh's bosom and giving suck. So the sort of maternal aspects were attributed to him. There's quite a lot of talk about people sitting under sacred trees. Then as you get through to the later books of the Old Testament, and of course, as you know, I'm sure you know, a lot of the books were written retrospectively after the exile to Babylon. So when they came back from Babylon, they rewrote a lot of the books. So we don't really know when the original books were written, although we do have early texts from Samaria, which probably original. They started to take out these trees and cut them down and have them removed from the story. And what I wanted to say to you is that although it seems to be the case that this is a modern phenomenon, a so-called Enlightenment phenomenon, that we've somehow created a much more rule-bound and narrow world, it does seem to be the case that this was actually happening in the development of the ancient Judaism, and that from something really rather lovely, rocks and stones and trees are part of their worship, and fire and air, and that something happened post-exile that made people say no. I mean, I imagine it was some kind of insecurity, having been exiled and then having come back to this so-called promised land. They needed to lay down some sort of really, heavy, I hesitate to say masculine, but it does look a bit like that. And I'm not sexist. I'm not one of those people. All men are dreadful and all women are right. I'm just saying, I was very interested because I thought, oh, this seems to always happen. It's just what I call the traffic warden mentality. You get a rather lovely thing. And somehow the human psyche seems to want to cut it down. I mean, it's very much like I describe happening in the Gardener when the Christians arrived. They cut down all the sacred groves. They couldn't get rid of the sacred wells and the sacred springs, so they just took them over and said they belong to saints now and not the ancient pagan beings.
Yes.
But it seems to me, I think this is original sin. I think there's something in the human psyche that gets to a certain point in civilization and it really needs to start controlling things. So I just wanted to sort of sound that out with you as I've got you, so to speak.
Well, it sets up a lot of ideas for me. But one is that I do think that in all cultures that I've any acquaintance with, there are myths about these two forces, one of them all-knowing, generous, and one of them knowing much less, but being set on control and power. And these two forces are there in North American native peoples' legends, in Chinese and Japanese legends, in Indian legends, and so on. So I think this can only come from deep insight into the structure of one's own mind. But there are these two hemispheric forces, if you like, or, I mean, of course, in saying that, it sounds very crude and simplistic, but 1,500 pages later, you realize that it's not quite as straightforward. But what I'm trying to say is that
I have read right through. Yes, I followed it.
Yes, no. But I'm just saying, for the sake of listeners, that there can be important polarities which are not absolute and not, etc., but are very important to recognize. And I think that what you're seeing there is the two minds. In Genesis, as you know, the creation myth is told twice. Yes. Once in a rather left hemisphere way, and once in a much more right hemisphere congruent way, in a number of respects. So it is quite interesting to look at it. Although actually, I'm rather taken with the first story in the very first verses because of that wonderful insight that God looked and saw that it was good, because it means that he wasn't all for being, it was just boringly, I suppose I better unpack a universe, here goes, but actually creating it and seeing what it was and knowing it for the first time. So, and that's a very, as you know, a very important theme for me, that whatever is divine is in the process of creation, as all creation is a matter of knowing the other and knowing yourself, that in this process, whatever that force is
it's interesting. But in that first, I'm with you. I prefer it too. And in that first chapter, he's not Yahweh. He's El. He's Elohim.
Right. Okay.
The interesting thing about Elohim, as I'm sure you know, but I'm just going to say this for the sake of people who don't. Elohim is actually a plural.
Yes.
Now, in the Hebrew, it's given a singular verb. So it's used as though it's a plural, which is singular. So in other words, it's a group of people acting as one, which I think is a much more generous idea of how creation comes.
Yes.
So it's as though all the hosts.
It's wonderful.
One body. Yeah, and it's also male and female. He created both. There's no, Eve out of Adam's rib, which people object to. I mean, I don't mind being a rib. I'm perfectly happy to be a rib, but it causes a bit of bother. But it's the second. It's Yahweh who is the one who starts laying down the law and setting these boundaries that they mustn't cross. And my just to sort of go on with my thinking for a minute, if you don't mind, I think those trees that they're not supposed to touch, the knowledge of good and evil, he doesn't say anything about the tree of life except afterwards. So we better not let them touch that, because then they'll become immortal like us, which seems rather mean. I think the trees are the leftover of the tree goddess that was once part and parcel of the family in the garden. And it's somehow got sort of, it's become somehow unacceptable. It's part of the whole process. It's sort of like Trotsky getting whited out in the photographs. It's got to be, can't have this. It's too, I don't know what it is. Can't control it. Can't control a tree. You can't, it's not.
Well, once again, you see, it's back to the left hemisphere need always to be the representative of control and power. And yes, it can play an important constructive role, but only as long as it's kept well under the aegis of a spirit that knows more than this and has other values than power and control. And And indeed, I'm very excited by the myth of creation in the Kabbalah, in the Lurian Kabbalah of Ein Sof, creating, but which I've recounted on other occasions. But what I was going to say is that in that tradition there are these two principles, halakha and agadah. And halakha is the principle of law and the sort of rigid and the laying down and thou shalt not and so on. And agadah is, in fact, they instantiate the points of view, if you like, or the takes on the world of the left hemisphere and of the right hemisphere. And I unpack a passage from Rabbi Heschel in the book on this theme. So I think it's always there. And of course, you see it in Islam, where there is, in my view, horrendously rigid fundamentalist cast of mind. But there is also a wonderfully creative and accepting cast of mind of the Sufis with their poetry, their music, their dance, and their laughter, all of which are strictly forbidden as aspects in the very puritanical version of Islam. And of course, we have Christianity. And I believe that we're now seeing is of the Puritans once again forbidding us to talk about certain things, to hold certain opinions, making windows into men's souls. As Queen Elizabeth said, "I shall not do," and the consequences are that our spiritual lives, our imaginative lives, our intellectual lives are being impoverished in a most unpleasant way, and we're being systematically subjected to a form of control by people who seem to me to be arrogant, self-righteous, and certain. And when you come across people who are certain they're right, alarm bells should start ringing. So I like what you're saying there, because it does seem to me to cut across the swathes of different ways, the mythologies, the religious traditions in which people have made sense of the world, that there are these two principles that vie with one another. But I'm with you that, and I'm glad that you are doing your part to rejuvenate and revivify these what are now thought of as pagan traditions, which are definitely there in Christianity in transformed form, and are definitely there in Judaism. Yeah.
Yes, and indeed in all religions, I think. And I think I very much liked your chapter on time. There's a lot in that probably we haven't got time to talk about. But, one of the points you make is that in times past, we had the elders and the wise old people who were there, as it were, to provide not just advice, but to act as the kind of library, the traditional library of the culture's past. And one of the ways this was done by the retelling of old stories, by the passing on of old stories. And one of the reasons I like to take an old story and, as it were, give it a new gloss, or polish it up and put it to work in a modern context, is that I believe these old stories are carrying time-honored truths, and I think this does two things. It first of all connects us with our own past, which seems to me very important, so that we're not just living in. You talk a lot about living in the present, and that, of course, is also very interesting. And what do we mean by the present, and how does that relate to eternity, and so on and so forth? But unquestionably, we have a past to which we should be connected in the same way that we should be connected to the community of the present. I think human beings are communal creatures, and we seem to have forgotten that sense of community, both with our current world, but also with our past world, which has an enormous amount to teach us.
I would say so, yes. And it does connect very much at least some of the things I have to say about time, because I try to make more accessible to people the idea, the really important idea, that the present is always there, but always flowing. It's always changing. So the present is not a now, which is static. It's a present that when you're in the flow, you're moving with time and seamlessly. So time doesn't seem to be passing. Time seems to be passing when you're outside of it. You stand on the bank, as I say, with your clipboard and your stopwatch, measuring things as they come past. But when you're actually in the flow of time, it is an eternal present. If it is a flow in this respect, then naturally it is entirely artificial and disrupts the nature of being, which is becoming in time, if we start thinking atomistically of ourselves here and now. And we're used now to thinking of ourselves atomistically as having a will that's separate from the will of humanity in general, and a fate that's separate from the fate of humanity in general, and what's good for me is separate from and all the rest. So we've narrowed it in space, but we've also narrowed it in time, so that we've cut ourselves off from our ancestors. And as Burke marvelously said in the 18th century, you know, we're part of a society, of a civilization, not only at this moment in time, but of the past and of the future. And that we have the present, not just as a bequest from our ancestors, but on loan from our children. And so to resettle this is terribly important. And just one last thing, it just seems to be so crass, so unbelievably crass, when you realize how little one person can know in a lifetime, just working from first principles, to cast away the condensed wisdom of 1,000 or 2,000 years.
Well, I couldn't possibly agree more. I mean, it's precisely what, again, I am often trying to write about. I mean, it's our old friend Donne, isn't it? No man is an island entire unto himself. You know, we are not separated from the rest of humanity, and the rest of humanity includes those who've gone before and those who will come after us. It's vitally important.
Yes.
That sense of connected. It's why I like, just to go back for a moment to the Genesis myth, I like the idea that there's somehow a sort of heavenly family who create the universe, not just a bloke with a beard. No respect to blokes with beards, but you know, it's it's a very different sort of image. I
yes.
There's
reasonably good company with Rowan Williams. His beard is slightly more impressive, I have to say. Well, no, sorry, carry on.
And David Bentley Hart's beard as well. I've obviously got a of blokes with beards, because you are three of my top favourite writers.
Right, okay.
It's on a slightly different tack with time, which is, do you know what is probably my favourite children's book next to the Alice books, which is Tom's Midnight Garden by Philippa Pearce? Did you come across that?
I have read it in childhood, actually, but I don't remember much about it.
Oh, that's a shame, because I think it would speak to you. Well, just to recap the story, it's about a boy who goes to stay with his uncle and aunt because his brother has measles, and it's written at a time when you could still get extremely ill from measles. You could get various complications. And he was going to build a tree house with his brother, and he's furious at being sent away. And they feed him rather too much food because they're trying to make him feel at home and better. And the upshot is he has indigestion, and he waits. He's lying awake at night and he hears the clock strike 13. And they're living in a flat in an old house, and downstairs lives old Mrs. Bartholomew. He's been told he must be really careful not to upset her because she's old and fussy, and it's her clock. But sort of intrigued by this, he goes downstairs and he opens the back door, and there is the most wonderful, beautiful garden. And he's furious because he feels his uncle and aunt have deceived him, because they've said, no, sorry, there's only a backyard, you can't go outside. And anyway, Mrs. Bartholomew. Anyway, to cut a very long, not a very long, but a rather wonderful story short, he visits this garden every night, and there he meets a girl whose name is Hattie. And it becomes clear to him and to us as readers that this is from a different age. It's an Edwardian age, in fact, because he sees her in 2 periods. And at one point, he asks her if she will leave her skates under the floorboards, because he is, in fact, his bedroom is the room that was her nursery. She does this, and he goes back into his everyday life, opens up the floor, and there is the skate. At the end of the book, when he's leaving, he comes downstairs. He's very sad to be going, because the garden, which he's become enamored of, and clearly he's fallen in love with Hattie as well. And old Mrs. Bartholomew comes up to wind up her grandfather clock, and she looks at him and she says, "Why, Tom?" And it's Hattie. And how, I mean, it still makes my hair stand on end, because she's been dreaming about her childhood, but she's dreaming about her childhood in which she actually met this boy who in her childhood didn't exist. And it's this Mobius loop of time that Philippa Pearce captures so brilliantly. I mean, it's I think, one of the principal sources of my own interest in time and the way time works in a non-linear way. And I think that is something you also, in your chapter on time, I mean, it's we do, of course, as you rightly say, live linear time. I mean, that is part of being embodied. But there is something about consciousness, and particularly dreams, I think, where time ceases to act in a linear way. It becomes more like a Mobius strip.
Yes, I mean, what I believe is that it flows, not necessarily that it's linear, and in a river isn't linear, and water has its cycles, and time has its cycles in almost every culture. So yes, but I know what you mean. I don't want to be difficult.
Sorry, what I meant was you're not in favour of the idea that we can somehow kind of escape outside.
No, I'm not. That's right. I think that the one thing that
yes,
we're embedded in time, and I argue that I don't know why I say it, but it's the one thing that we cannot wish away, and that even God can't make undone what has been done, as it were. So, which is what I think. I quote.
You do.
I quote a Greek poet who says that, actually, but it's also implicit in Dogen, who says, if there were no time, there would be no mountains. There could be nothing actually that we know at all. So, but who knows? I mean, it's possible that in a world that because of the way we're constructed, we simply can't know that there is no time. And I suppose rather like Niels Bohr, who I very much admire. He says that, in doing science, we're not actually saying this is how the real structure of things is. We're just developing an idea, a set of ideas about it that work well together and work better than any of the others that we've tried. And so I think it would be a very bad idea and a cheap move to try and take time out of the picture. Though I can't possibly say any more than any other human being can say what ultimately happens, because we have no access to that. It's just that I think it brings all kinds of thought, all kinds of reason, all kinds of converse, all kinds of experience, all kinds of science to nothing if you just say, well, time doesn't exist.
No, I mean, it clearly does exist, and brightness falls from the hair, queens have died young and fair. Yes.
Yes. Interesting. You go for the hair, do you? Because the other one is brightness falls from the air. But we don't know which Nash meant, actually. But I think both versions are preserved. I rather like brightness falls from the air. But
I do too, but it said hair because I was trying to suggest that
the age, yes.
The inevitable process of aging. But I was going to say one thing about time in this respect, which is one of the effects of working as an analyst. I noticed, and you will have had the same experience working as a psychiatrist, is that you can sort of affect time, because when people's attitude changes, their history changes with it. And I had many examples of people who, I mean, essentially people come with a story, and it is only a story. And all we ever have, I think everything's a story. Actually, I think everything's a story. Science is a story too. It's a different sort of story, but it's
it is. Definitely, yes.
And one interpretation of, in the beginning is the word in the Greek, is in the beginning is the story. I mean, logos can mean narrative. I like to think in the beginning was the story, and God was the story, and the story was God. It's my rather irreverent way of interpreting the Gospel of John. But I used to quite often have the experience, sometimes quite striking, of how somebody would come with a story of deprivation, unhappiness, sadness, betrayal, tragedies of a greater or lesser depth. But over time, their attitude to that past might change. And so their history might change. So there is something about personal time, I think, which is a bit more fluid.
I like that. Yes, and it reminds me of a couple of things. One is Eliot in, I think, Tradition and the Individual Talent, saying slightly paradoxically that every poet creates his predecessors, in the sense that by their place in the tradition, they cast a light on what went before. And it's a point made earlier and more strikingly, I think, by Bergson, when he says that in essence, every part of this unfolding of time changes both what is happening now, what will happen in the future, and what happened in the past. And it's possible that if Romanticism had never occurred, we see in classicism as the first glimmerings of Romanticism would not have been the first glimmerings of Romanticism. They might not have been there or noticeable, if you see what I mean, without the coming into being of Romanticism, which changed them necessarily. The lovely point made by a contemporary physicist, and I can't remember the name offhand, but the point he makes is that no two things in the cosmos can ever be the same, something I profoundly believe. Everything is unique, as Emerson said, two blades of grass are never the same. But because if you were able to repeat the circumstances exactly, they would be repeated with a different history, because one would be later than the other. So history never actually repeats itself in that way.
And it's why even identical twins are never quite identical.
Yes.
But I think that's
one of the reasons.
Really, really interesting point. And I'm so glad you like Bergson, because I'm a great fan of Bergson, and you make a lot of point of him, and he's really fallen out of fashion. And his élan vital, I think, is deeply misunderstood. I mean, it's not some sort of thing that
utterly traversed. No, it's travesty. It's not understood. You're absolutely right.
Completely misunderstood. But I think it's absolutely true. And I used to have the experience. I mean, I've recounted this before, but nobody listening to your channel is likely to have heard this before. But I remember a particular occasion where a woman who had a very bad relationship with her mother, and in fact left Australia in order to get away from the mother, and came to me with a story of genuine distress and bad memories. Clearly, these were not being made up, which you can get sometimes. But I believed her. But she had, on one occasion, a sudden recollection as a result of a dream she had, and this is, I'm quite interested about dreams, if we can get around to it.
Mm.
She had a dream. In the dream, she dreamt about a bracelet, and asked her about the bracelet. She suddenly remembered it was given to her by her mother, and that her mother had actually given her the bracelet and put it on her wrist, and then kissed her rather tenderly on the forehead. And she told me the story, and she wept. And I listened and was moved. And she went home, and the next time I saw her, she said, you know, when I got back, there was a message from my mother on the answer phone. She and her mother hadn't spoken for years. So now you could say that's a coincidence, and who's to say it isn't? But it's pretty remarkable. I honestly believe, because I've had so many examples of this, that there is something that happens. There's some, you know, like the particles in particle physics that are affected. If one is affected, the other is affected, even if they are at immense difference. I think the entanglement of the psyche of psyches has an effect. As I'm constantly boring my family by saying thought is real. Thought is real. Thought, I think, has an ontological effect. It affects people. Thoughts,
it clearly does,
in your head become a book which affect people. You know, they affect me, they affect your thousands of readers. I have a thought that becomes Julia Garnet or Hassie Days, and it becomes a book, and it affects people. And by the same token, like particle physics, I think I've told you before, I worked for a long time with Wheeler, John Archibald Wheeler, whose some hero was Niels Bohr, and he used to say to me, whenever he was, I did some work for him on Einstein, but he used to say to me whenever he was at a point of a dilemma, at this point I always ask myself, what would Niels Bohr say?
Yes.
I do know a bit about particle physics, and I was once married to a physicist, but I've always found that this applies also to the people's consciousness. If they're entangled, I believe to this day, the mother in Australia, at some, I don't know how it works, but somehow or other, she was moved by her daughter's softening of the heart. Or perhaps all three of us, I don't know, my heart was softened, my patient's heart was softened, the mother's heart, something happened. It's...
Yes, that's a lovely thought.
And I think it's... Do you agree, though? I mean, do you share this?
I'm open to it as a possibility. I mean, I certainly think I accept that dreams, because I think this has happened to me, have referred to things that are just about to occur. In some cases, they've been so vivid that I know that it happened in that order, the dream first and the experience later. Yes, I have experienced that, and I know examples that I have no particular reason to completely disbelieve of very much more dramatic things happening in this way. And I don't see why consciousness, I mean, you shouldn't necessarily know, I think it does know bounds, because that's what makes it possible to be you or me or somebody else, that there are limits, as it were, to our consciousness. But that nonetheless, this is connected to a field of consciousness which is universal. And I don't see why within that there shouldn't be resonances, entanglements. Interestingly, particle physicists have shown that particles, I mean, this is at the other end of the scale from the spiritual thing you're talking about, but subatomic particles that never coexisted can be entangled, which is very interesting. They were never in existence at the same moment in time, and yet they share. And you know, that thought has effects on matter is very obvious. I mean, hypnosis couldn't work if that were not the case. Even something as simple and everyday as good old CBT couldn't work. And if getting you to think differently actually changes the levels of chemicals in your brain, thought has influenced matter. So, I mean, we know this. It's perverse to deny it. So there are, I believe ultimately that what's important is not to fall into the habit, which is very much a habit of our culture, that if you distinguish things, they must be divided. But I believe in making distinctions, but not necessarily imposing separation. We don't know if things are truly separate ever, but we can certainly distinguish between them. We can distinguish the two poles of a magnet, one from another, and they have different properties and they work differently. And it's very clear that they're not actually separate from one another. If you took one away, the other would disappear, and there's no point in the magnet, which is the hard and fast barrier between the North Pole and the South Pole. So I think that a lot of experiences has that sort of structure to it.
I think the other thing about dreams, though, is that it can, they often, and you get this a great deal, I think, particularly in ancient literature. I mean, it happens a lot in the Bible and in a lot of
yes.
old stories, that they do impart, dreams can impart knowledge which you aren't consciously aware of. I mean, I think a lot of dreams are simply detritus, and I don't say every dream is deeply dripping with significance or whatever.
No.
A lot of dreams do, in fact. I had a number, I mean, like a lot of people, I had a lot of particularly vivid, I'm a vivid dreamer anyway, but I had a lot of vivid dreams during lockdown. And quite early in the first lockdown, I had a dream that I was giving a lecture to a sort of full theatre of students. And the lecture was on the Iliad. And in the lecture, I had, in the dream, I had a lecture prepared, which was about some detail in the Iliad, which it was about King Priam. And I mean, I don't remember it now, of course, but all I remember was it was some sort of esoteric academic point. But before I gave the lecture, I looked around and I said, oh, by the way, do you all know the story of the Iliad? And only 2 or 3 people put up their hands. So I set aside literally my lecture notes and proceeded in the dream to tell the story of the Iliad. And when I woke up, I thought, well, what's this about? Why am I dreaming about it? And first of all, I thought, well, your academic life and your academic, and I am quite interested in academic things, is over, and you're a storyteller. So your job is not to analyze the Iliad, it's to tell the stories of the ancient thing. So that was my sort of first thought. Then I went away and looked up the Iliad and got out my Lerb edition. And what I'd forgotten is that the Iliad begins with a plague on the Greeks. And the plague on the Greeks is brought about because Agamemnon has taken as a concubine the daughter of the priest of Apollo. And Apollo has become angry and he sent a plague on the Greeks. And I thought, this isn't a dream about me being a storyteller and not an academic. This is a dream about COVID, because we've angered the gods. And this is the wonderful thing about myth, very much like poetry. Apollo is both the god of enlightenment and light, but also the god of destruction and plague. And it depends which side you want. And I thought, we've sinned against nature. We've angered the gods, and they're sending us a plague.
Yes.
I couldn't possibly, I hadn't thought that thought. It came to me through the dream. So it was interesting. It had both a sort of slight personal message, because I was about to write The Gardener. So a bit of me was, mucking about, looking up things and reading about ancient pagan sites instead of writing my story. But the larger truth was this ancient work, which you know quite well, but had totally forgotten the beginning of, is telling you something.
Yes. I like that very much, yes.
And I think dreams can do that. They can make patent. I mean, I know the Iliad quite well. I've taught it. I could indeed give a lecture on Priam. If I was so inclined, I could indeed tell you the story. But I probably wouldn't have started from that rather odd beginning, because after that it gets into Achilles and the whole lot. That's the beginning of it. And that was the important part of the dream, I think. So I think dreams do that. And, once again, apart from in psychoanalysis, Freudian analysis gives a very reductive view of dreams.
Yes.
Hence my book, Where Three Roads Meet, trying to give Freud a different view of mythology.
Yes.
Jungians pay great attention to dreams, but it's not nowadays something that rests easily in our culture. It's thought to be a rather sort of weird thing, I think, and yet it's and yet it's knowledge that we have available to us every night. I mean, it's interesting.
Yes. I mean, whether or not it in fact gives us glimpses of something to come, I don't know, but it may give us glimpses of things that we intuit are to come.
Yes.
And in that sense, put us in touch with knowledge that we have. And so, for example, in the last couple of years, I've had a couple of dreams that were not actually terrifying, were almost surprising for their lack of for their very lack of instilling fear. Although they represented fearful scenes. One was of being in a building that I suppose was the nearest I can imagine, one of the rooms in the Bodleian Library with very tall windows of glass. And it was on the ground floor, and there were bookcases from floor to ceiling. And I think there was some sort of celebration going on in it, in this library, this college, whatever it was. And then I noticed that there was water flowing right past the window, I mean, above the bottom of the window. And I was thinking, well, if this rises anymore, the pressure is going to be so great, it's just going to come in and drown us. And I could see the water rising to extraordinary heights. And in the end, it didn't, but I felt interested by this. And then I had another dream, which I won't recount because it's longer, but it involved an idea of a house that was my house that was on an island, and there were two rivers that went by, and actually the water was coming in underneath and rising up. Perhaps I'm giving away too much about myself, but, no. I have had some very I mean, I think of the way in which Jung had images that foreshadowed the war, you know, and I wonder if, you know, we've not only made Apollo angry, we've made Gaia angry, and this was an image of what is coming. I mean, I live in a place which is at sea level, and so perhaps at some level that was my image of the destruction of everything that is coming, which I also think is not just coming from nature, but actually it's coming from the breakdown of civil society, but that's another story. Have you had the experience I've had of, I think some of the most profound spiritual experiences I've had have been in dreams. I certainly remember one. Yep. And I've had experience of emotions that have no counterpart in the real world. So I know there are emotions I've had that afterwards I can't specify what that emotion was in any way. So I think it expands one's possible emotional repertoire being asleep. I don't know.
I think that's true. And I've definitely, I mean, I've quite often had that experience, which I'm sure you've had too, of being in love with somebody who I don't know. I mean, you know, I don't know this person. I'm
yes.
I mean, I've also had dreams about being in love with people I do know, which can be rather embarrassing when, you know, not particularly interested in them. I don't know what that's about, but I've also had I don't really know how to characterize them, but I do exactly know what you mean. I think there's a palette of I've just come back from seeing Delacroix's palette, and it's the most artist's palette. It's the most extraordinary artifact with all the different colors he used, which he kept. And it's as though somehow we've suddenly been given Delacroix's palette rather than a sort of paint box, you know, that's sort of the sort one's given as a child. But somehow there's a much richer, subtler, more nuanced range of colors that have arrived.
So that's a lovely way of putting it. Yeah,
it is this, as you say, it's this widening of, and this. I mean, do you dream in color? I definitely dream in color. But
yes, oh gosh, yes, absolutely, no question.
Hear music, because I also hear music.
Yes. In fact, I dreamt once a piece of Handel that was so astonishingly beautiful. It was more beautiful. I mean, I admire Handel, but it was more beautiful than anything that Handel ever wrote. Unfortunately, it disappeared when I woke up. I also dreamt a poem by Dryden, which made me think, I've really got to reevaluate Dryden. This is bloody amazing poem. Again, I couldn't remember it when I woke up, but it was better than anything that Dryden actually wrote. Although, in a slightly lesser way than Handel, he was a great figure. But I've also, I mean, as well as having very unusual feelings that, as it were, are part. I like that idea of Delacroix's palette, that, as it were, it's not in the paint box, it's something, but it's still there. But I also had a very interesting, I don't know whether I should tell this, dream, that I was giving a tutorial to somebody about Goethe. You see, you giving lectures in your dreams, I'm giving tutorials. And I was reading a sonnet of Goethe's to somebody. I don't think he was much of a sonnet writer, but anyway. And as the way these things are in dream, of course, the poem was in French, you know. And when it got to the last line, the last words of the last line, at the end of the poem, was the French words "la mort," M-O-R-T, and in my mind it sort of spliced itself with l'amour, love, and death and love came together. And at that very moment, I experienced a sense of the most intense spiritual pleasure. And in my dream, I thought, is this just an orgasm? And then, rather like as you you get in sometimes in film clips, they put a little inset in the top right-hand corner so you can see the commentator or whatever it is while you're watching the main thing. There was a little inset which had a real orgasm in it. And it was quite clear to me that this was something far greater and more profound than the most earth-shatteringly beautiful orgasm. So that was a remarkable dream, but it wasn't one of the more mystically beautiful ones. It just wasn't one I don't know quite what to make of it.
I think the bringing of love and death together, and of course, you know, the little death in French is an orgasm. So
yes, and Elizabethans wrote all the time when they said "I die," they meant exactly that.
And Elizabethans, yes, and Shakespeare all the time is saying I die." Well, on the same note, I haven't quite got. And I'll just say in parenthesis, I don't know if you noticed, but Miss Garnet, when she sees the angel Raphael and recognizes him, thinks it's possibly something akin to an orgasm. If she were in a position to know such a thing, she's never had.
Know what it was? Yes, you mentioned.
I mean, I instinctively made that connection with the. You know, I mean, there's often a very erotic feeling, isn't there, to the vision?
Yes.
So forth. But on the same sort of confessional.
Teresa of Avila by Bernini, yes, in yeah.
That when I was about 7, I dreamt I was a unicorn. Now, you know, I can't tell this to a Freudian because they'll think it's a penis envy dream. And I was a unicorn, and I was at a cocktail party. Now, God knows how I came to be dreaming about a cocktail party. I don't think I ever. I mean, obviously it's 7. I mean, my parents used to have people around to have sherry from time to time. Anyway, what I remember about it was I was standing on 3 legs, and with the 4th leg, I was holding out a plate of cocktail biscuits. And I was thinking, this is not what a unicorn should be doing. I've actually never confessed to this dream, not even to my analysts, because I was so horrified by the idea they were going to instantly say, well, did you perhaps want a penis when you were 7? I certainly have never wanted all in favour of penises, but not on me. I was definitely a unicorn. So this is again...
Yes.
I'm definitely thinking this isn't right. This isn't what unicorns do. So in a way,
you and I are.
Go on.
No, I was going to say you and I are old enough to remember a television ad. You can take a white horse anywhere. goes up the stairs into the party. But I think dreams can be very funny, and they can make puns, and they can actually. I mean, I've sometimes woken myself up from a dream laughing.
Oh, yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And my old analyst, Anthony Stevens, who now lives in Greece, in his early days, he worked as a doctor in a psychiatric unit in Greece. He has a great love of the country, and he said he was out in the countryside with a friend, and they were at an ancient site, and it was a temple to Dionysus, and he all his life has taken a nap at lunchtime, so he fits in very well with the Mediterranean culture. So he lay down in this ancient site, and he was mucking about with his friend, and they were making jokes about the gods. He lay down in this site and fell asleep, and he had a dream in which Dionysus appeared to him, and Dionysus said to him, "Don't muck about."
Right. Okay.
So,
I thought Dionysus was in favour of mucking about.
Well, I don't think he was in favour of my old analyst, as it were, slightly taking the sacred Kamenos. So I remember him telling me that very early on. So I think we can agree there's something about dreams, and we don't quite know what it is. But certainly, I mean, again, like with the ancient stories, they're very time-ordered ancient ways of people communing with a slightly different part of their consciousness, aren't they? And which it's a dialogue with a different aspect of one's own consciousness.
Yes, I'm sure that's exactly what it is, and terribly important in a world in which we're so rigidly held within this very explicit, very rationalistic, in a very simple-minded way, culture, in which the deeper things are not talked about and are not so available. So this is why books like yours, the understanding of the value of poetry, of myth, of narrative, of drama, is so important. I think drama is also a very great thing, isn't it? I mean, at moments of flourishing of civilizations, drama has been, in the Greeks, in the Romans, and in our own case, in the Elizabethan era, has been so important as a way of playing out before our eyes something that, certainly in Shakespeare's case, one feels he hadn't fully conceived at the time he was writing it, but the characters in the play take on a life of their own and then become out of control. He has to let them do their thing.
Have you seen the interview with Harold Bloom on Hamlet, where he makes just that point? He says Hamlet is the play that got away from Shakespeare, that somehow it's a play, it is an extraordinary play, and of course it does that thing of having a play within a play that I'm always very, very interested in. These layers, different layers of watching and consciousness and coming into being, somehow reflect the different levels that we have within ourselves. We have an audience that watches ourselves, and then something else. There is something very extraordinary about, but I completely agree with you about drama. And of course, for the Greeks, it was a religious activity, the great Dionysus.
Yes, it was. Yes. I was reading lately and actually interviewed him for my channel, a book by my brother, Iain McGilchrist, on Pythagoras.
Which I have here.
Oh, right.
Yep.
Oh,
here's something.
Gosh. Well, I think it would be very much up your street, actually, because it's very much. Yes. In all sorts of ways. But I mean, he begins by making the point that other cultures like Babylon and Egypt had inherited sacred texts that were sort of at the top of the pyramid, and it was very hierarchical, and there were priests and so on. But when it came to Greece, it was sort of, they had no inherited sacred texts, and indeed they worked things out, as he puts it, in a sort of laboratory of the mind on stage, and that these are ways of parts of the mind speaking in the way that they do through an oracle, or through the priest or whatever. So I thought that was a lovely point, and
very good point.
It helps to illustrate why it seems to me that drama becomes so crucial and so vivid at these turning points in civilizations when they're flourishing, and why at the moment I think drama is not going through a terribly brilliant phase. But that's just perhaps my being a Philistine.
No, you're not a Philistine. I'm afraid I share your view. Yes. But
again, a bit too intellectual, I think. Too much about ideas, not enough about actually what Shakespeare is clearly about, things coming to life in front of your eyes and doing what they do, but not in a trivial way. They're acting out the most deep things that we can be acquainted with.
And the thing about Shakespeare is he's never stereotypical. I mean, if you look at current A-level papers on Hamlet, I'm sorry, I'm going to get into the bee in my bonnet again. I was looking at a A-level question on Hamlet the other day, and it's the old chestnut. How far is Hamlet a revenge tragedy? Well, it's a total dismiss. It breaks apart the idea of a revenge tragedy. I mean, the thing about Shakespeare is he's never cliched. He's never stereotypical.
No.
Not received ideas. There are ideas that he's constantly pushing outside the sort of cultural norm. And if we do that nowadays, we're liable to get into trouble.
Yes. Well, that's right. His kings are never suited to be kings. His tyrants are never suited to be tyrants. Whatever they are. And the most lovely example is whatever he's called. Is it Barnabas or something like that? The ruffian in Measure for Measure, whose only role, inherited from wherever it was the story comes from, was to be murdered so that his head could be substituted in the story of the plot. And the hangman says, yes, come on, Barnabas, arise and be hanged. And he goes, well, no, damn you, I refuse to be hanged. So Shakespeare has to find another way of doing the plot. It's the most perfect example of the rebellion of the character that I can think of.
That's a very, very good.
No, this is... It's so wonderful. I mean, that they're never ever just cliches, stereotypes, and so on. And for an era that seems obsessed with stereotypes, and if you're not a stereotypical woman, you can't be a woman. If you're not a stereotypical man, you must be something else. This is wrong, in my view. Anyway.
One of the many years ago, I knew Iris Murdoch, and scary but clever Iris Murdoch, and her charming husband, John Bailey, and we were having a conversation.
Who was my tutor, as you know, and so I knew them both well.
I'd forgotten
that. Yes.
Well, we became very good friends, and he was extremely nice to my children because they shared a love of horror movies and Sherlock Holmes. And he used to swap horror stories with my sons, and discuss Sherlock Holmes. But I was having a conversation with him about Shakespeare once, and I said I was rather young at the time, well, of course we can't say anything about Shakespeare, the man. And John Bailey said in his gentle voice, I think we can say he was not fanatical. I can say he's never fanatical. He's never point. He doesn't really have a point of view. He inhabits the point of view of his character, but he doesn't.
Yes.
But he's willing to accept.
It's so important because what it is he never has designs on you. Is the best way to put it. And great novelists never have designs on you. Dickens never has designs on the reader, it seems to me. Jane Austen doesn't have designs on the reader. It's sometimes said that George Eliot does have designs on the reader because she somewhat moralizes and so forth. But I nonetheless think she's a very great writer.
But what happens now? Acceptable design. She has a few, and I think Dickens has a few.
Yes. Yes, he does. He does. No, yes, I think he has some.
Yes,
he has some moralistic and religious designs. That is true, but certainly Shakespeare had no designs, and that's why we don't really know what he thought. It really is not. You're not being given a message. But nowadays, we're always the writer, the playwright has designs on the audience, persuading them of some fashionable truth or some point of view that he or she wants us to follow. But that's really not what drama should be for. And we shouldn't come away feeling that we've been lectured to. But nowadays, one does.
I think it's not just that, actually. I think it's something a bit more insidious, which is that there are fashionable takes on life. So it's not so much precept that's being, although it might be, but it's a very fashionable take on life that life is basically grim, and that the bad things that happen are more significant and somehow truer than the good things that happen. Now, I think you and I agree that quite a lot of probably rather sinister things are happening to our civilization. But I think you and I would also agree that the world is a marvelous place and full of wonder and beauty and delight.
Absolutely.
Beauty and delight are not terribly much in fashion at the moment. It would be thought, I mean, I get this in my books, the parts of my books that deal with the beauties of nature or the whatever it is are considered it not the thing, because I am not I do explore grief and loss and unhappiness.
I know,
but there's always a sense that there's another side to things, and that's what I get tired of. I get tired of accentuating the negative, and I think if you accentuate the negative in a culture, then that comes. It's your
yes.
It feeds the imagination with negative thoughts.
Yes,
so there is a sort of general sense that we're a lot less happy and at ease with ourselves and at ease with the world we live in. And in the impoverished ages that came before us. I mean, it's very, very old-fashioned.
Well, but it's borne out, I'm afraid, by masses of research. It's the fact that we never were so anxious, depressed, miserable and lonely as we now are, and we're constantly grasping for things that we hope will give us contentment or fulfillment, but they don't, because our whole view of the world is resolutely opposed to discovering things that, if we allowed ourselves to discover them, we would begin to give meaning to life. And these are opening yourself to the sheer wonder of the world, the beauty of the world, to love, and to admiration and delight in its complex, orderly beauty, which is not the same thing as saying that it has a rigid structure. It actually doesn't. It's the opposite of that I'm talking about. But this is what we've lost. And I think it's left humanity adrift in a terrible way. And therefore, if one can talk of developments that are evil, then these developments are evil developments. They are destroying us, destroying our society. Now, you may say, but that is itself a very negative point of view. But I want to make a distinction between optimism and negativity. I believe my attitude to life is positive. There is so much in life that I love, that I appreciate, that I find beautiful, special, real, and present to me. And that is the secret. And even if the world around you is not looking good, this is something that is most vivid in things like Viktor Frankl's reports of the concentration camps, that even when things were obviously not looking optimistic, nonetheless, it was possible to find great meaning in life. And I came across this thing that I think is very good. I've mentioned it a couple of times lately, but I'm going to mention it again because I think it's so good. As soon as I read it, it struck me, and it's from a blogger called Rod Dreher, and he was saying, hope is not the conviction that things are going to get better. It's a belief that everything ultimately, including, and perhaps above all, suffering, has deep meaning. And I think that is right. I know that feeling of meaning. I know what it is to see the meaning in these things. And wow, great art is giving it to you all the time if you just open your eyes to it. And nature too is, of course, not always benign, but my God, is nature awe-inspiring and beautiful. And one of the things that really struck me in writing about biology for this book and researching was, when you read Darwin, he is constantly saying how beautiful.
Yes.
The word either beauty or beautiful occurs on average on every other page in The Descent of Man. Now, how many scientists, particularly the neo-Darwinians, as they call themselves now, right, who are much more narrow-minded than Darwin, writing about biology, use words like beauty and beautiful all the time in what they're talking about?
I completely agree with you. And the other thing to add to that, and I think you talk about it in your chapter on time, I'm sure you do, is we don't give ourselves time because people are always constantly busy. And you may say, but people have to earn a living. And yes, of course they do. But something bad has happened to the way we occupy our time. It's I have a perhaps rather irritating habit of telling people in a rather defiant way that I'm a very lazy person. I am a very lazy person, but I'm rather proud of it. I mean, I feel it's a mark in my favor that I would very much rather look out at the window and ponder on things than do any number. I mean, it's not that I never do anything.
Yes.
I write books and
No.
I've done various jobs and so forth. But for me, time is extremely precious, and
yes,
it is not to be frittered away on worrying about this, that, and the other. I mean, I'm not going to spend 45 minutes trying to recover the cost of my Gatwick Express ticket because the Gatwick Express was cancelled, because I know fine well that it's going to take me 3/4 of an hour and then I'm still not going to be getting, and then I'll get back, 12 hours. You might say, well, it's all right for her.
It's a very,
but there's things I will not do because not only will it,
I don't think you're,
but it'll fuss up my head. It'll fill my head. Ziggy like.
You're completely right, and it has been said that busyness is a way of true laziness. In other words, you're not actually engaging with things; you're skating from one thing to the next in a hurry, and actually not allowing yourself to encounter reality fully. And for this reason, of course, there's one of the great masterpieces of Japanese literature is translated as Essays in Idleness by Yoshida Kenko in the 12th century, I think. And then there's can't think of his name now, Joseph Pieper, his lectures just after the war on idleness, the foundation of civilization. And of course, what he's not talking about is a simple empty kind of nothingness. He's talking about the cultivation of a discipline whereby you attend and you make space and time in your life to attend to the things that really matter. Now, I know because I've been very busy and I've done a job that was so ridiculously busy that now it would be against the law. But in those days, I was allowed to work 120 hours a week in a hospital on a neuro high care unit and looking after all kinds of patients. I've had 3 children. I know what it is to be busy, but But one has to make an effort not to allow one's attention to be constantly seized. The trouble is your attention has been monetized by business, and capitalism desires you always to be distracted from whatever would give you a deeper insight into life to the need to have this little amusing, fun gadget or whatever it is. And if you keep watching that and allowing your attention to be fragmented in this way, you enter the left hemisphere world in which everything becomes two-dimensional. It lacks depth. The emotional realm is cut off. The spiritual realm is cut off. And you have to really cultivate finding them again by going back into peace and silence. So anyway, maybe that's a note on which we should, peace and silence, maybe the note on which we should
can I add just one
draw things to a close? Of course, yes. It
is that I think Jane Austen was also in favour of laziness, what I'm going to call laziness, because I rather like using the word. If you notice in her books, it's the busy characters who are the evil characters. It's Mrs. Norris.
Or at least the absurd ones, Mrs. Elton.
Oh, Mrs. Norris and Mrs. Bennet, who bustled about. Now, Lady Bertram, who's so lazy she can't even think of a name for her dog and just calls it Pug.
Yes.
She's actually the character who is rather kind and is kind to Fanny. So I have a fantasy that Jane Austen understood this rather well. She, of course, as you will know, was not at all well and spent a lot of her time on the sofa. But I think if you look at her characters, she has a very sharp eye for people who fill up their lives and a great deal of, because busyness is often an attempt to control either the busy person's life or worse, other people's lives.
Other people.
That is something which I'm so antipathetic.
No, I know. And no doubt you have met, and I certainly have, people who are absolutely certain that their highly controlling attitude towards their family is an exhibition of their love.
Yes.
And when you say, well, maybe actually letting go and allowing them a little more freedom might be also a way of loving them. It's something that it takes time for them to understand quite often. So, yes. Well, there we go.
Yes. Well, lovely to talk.
I don't think you're lazy at all. I know you're not. You couldn't write the books you write if you were. And I sometimes think of myself, I mean, I have literally said to myself in the past, looking at The Master and His Emissary, and I suppose a 40-year-old now looking at the matter of things, did you write those books, but you're lazy? How could you have done that? And I therefore think that, probably they were written by the mice when they came in the night, and left little notes saying no more.
Taylor of Gloucester.
Taylor of Gloucester, no more twist.
Yes.
Anyway, so it's been absolutely lovely talking to you, Sally. Thank you very, very much for joining me. And I know we could talk forever probably, but we have to be reasonably limited.
All right.
Good. Thank you very much.
Bye, Ian.
And you. Yes.
And keep being lazy if it produces books of that quality.
Altrettanto. Yes.
I'll get back.
Very good.
Bye-bye.
Bye.